Um, Brendan, hello. So, another question. Out of the three planes, which one was objectively the best? The German Focke-Wulf 190, the British Spitfire, or the P-51 Mustang? Well, um, that's a tough one, boy. They're all so the Spitfire had a Rolls-Royce engine in it, if I'm not mistaken. Um, the P-51 Mustang, though, is probably the best out of them, I would say. That's not me being American-centric. Um, I think it depends on objectively the best in what category. The one that you didn't include on there is the Mitsubishi uh, Zeros from Japan. Those were the fastest. The what are those things called? Now I'm blanking on the actual name of them. A6M. So the Zero was the fastest plane used, the fastest fighter plane used in World War II. And so that's another good one. Let's see here. Focke-Wulf 190 doesn't come, let's see here. There's not many of them. Let's see, 20,000 of them built. The Focke-Wulf ended up being outdated by the end of the war. That's the main problem with that one. P-51 Mustang. Probably, I'm gonna just go ahead and say it's probably the Mustang. Yeah, some of them are tricky to spell. Sometimes you can find the answer in other questions because the words are used again. But don't worry too much about the spelling. Just do the best you can with it. Most of the time I can figure out what you meant to say. Yeah, I think you'd have a hard time going back to Brendan's original question. I think you'd have a hard time arguing that the P-51 Mustang wasn't the best one. I mean, don't get me wrong though, because all of them are very good. I mean, it's not like one was way better than all of the others, but the P-51 Mustang was really a revolutionary plane in many respects, and even though it's extremely similar in design to the Spitfire and the Hurricane, but but it's just all of those planes though are from an era where they were using actual internal combustion engines in the plane rather than jets, and so they're just different. They're cool. They're old and they're cool. I always think that World War II planes are some of the coolest planes there are. Um, you know, the Spitfire basically single-handedly saved London, so there is something to be said about that. That's a tough question. Tough question, but I think I'm going to go with P-51 Mustang. All right. Well, kids, um, let's see here. We're going back again in the PowerPoint to where we left off before we started talking about the Holocaust. Remember, the Holocaust is kind of its own event that happens during World War II, and since the start of the Holocaust happens really in some sense before the war even begins, we kind of had to go back and talk a little bit about Kristallnacht and all of the Nuremberg laws that started to be passed that were discriminatory policies against Jewish folks. And so yes, and of course, I'm sure that you heard the news that we are returning back to school next week, starting Monday. I will see you guys on Tuesday, or at least half of you I will see on Tuesday. And of the half of you I see on Tuesday, half of them will be in the morning and half of them will be in the afternoon. So, and then I will see the other half of the students on Thursday of next week. So yeah, we're starting up this new hybrid schedule. What I can do here is I can pull up, let's see, how can I do this? Let's just go here. Let's go here. And let's go here. And we're going to go to, let's see here, this one. Okay, so just in case you wanted to take a look at the schedule here, all right, here's the schedule, all right. You can find your cohort there. If you are in cohort A, that means that you'll be showing up in the morning time to school on Monday and Tuesday, okay? Monday for 135, Tuesday for 246. And then if you're in B cohort, that means you're going to show up in the afternoon time on Monday and Tuesday, starting at noon. All right, now as you can see there, Friday, I guess, did get designated for remote office hours. So, we may end up doing some stuff on Fridays based on, I'll announce it if we end up doing stuff on Fridays. But for the most part, pretty much what you just have to worry about is this. One, showing up during your cohort time on Monday and Tuesday, all right, to the actual school. And then for my class, which is second period, okay, I'm going to be talking, what happens in, let's say you're in cohorts B, C, and D, okay? And it's Tuesday morning and I'm meeting with cohort A. I will be live streaming on YouTube my lecture that I do with cohort A, and you will, if you're in B, C, or D at that time, you still have to tune in and watch what's going on in the classroom, because I have to keep I have to keep moving forward in the class. I can't get through the rest of the year with only 45 minutes of instructional time a week. So you're going to be responsible to tune in when it's not your cohort day for the class, and watch what's going on when that happens. So what will happen is, for example, I'll lecture in the morning time for second period cohort A, and in the afternoon time I'll do the second half of the lecture, and I will have expected that people who are showing up in the afternoon for cohort B listened to what I was doing with cohort A remotely. So I'm not gonna, when you show up if you're in cohort B and you show up in the afternoon, I'm gonna be moving on from the stuff that I lectured on in the morning time, okay? So that's on you to tune into that so that you don't miss content of what goes on. All right, and that between the two, 45 minutes here and 45 minutes here, that gives us our full 90-minute class period that I need in order to do my job. Okay, so just remember, even though you may not be showing up to the classroom, you're still responsible to tune in and listen to what goes on so that you don't fall behind for what happens that afternoon or what happens on Thursday when A and B are at home. Okay? So please just stay on top of what you need to do. I know it's a new schedule. I know it's different than what we've been used to for this school year, but let's just all be responsible and do what we need to do and tune in and do our jobs. Any questions on that? Questions on the schedule? Where's my class? Great question, Michael. So my class is in the STEM campus, okay? All right, third floor, STEM campus. I'm in the north building on the STEM campus, and my classroom is T302. Okay, T302, STEM campus, north building, third floor, second class from the end. Are tests going to be in person from next week on? I haven't decided on that, Elijah. When do we go to your Zooms? Isaiah, when you say, when do we go to my Zooms, do you mean for office hours or do you mean for the other scheduled class times? So you just tune in during that class time, Isaiah. I know it's kind of confusing, but you know, Isaiah, for example, what cohort are you in, Isaiah? Okay, so for your scenario, for cohort D, here's what you're going to do. Here's what your schedule is going to be like for my class, okay? Just for my class. Tuesday morning at 7:40, all right, from your house, you are going to go into Canvas just like you've been doing, and you will find a link there where you'll be able to see me lecture to the class that is in my, or the cohort that is in my classroom, all right? Then that afternoon at 12:12, you'll get back onto Canvas and find another link, all right? And you'll tune in for the second half of class there. And then that'll wrap up by 1 o'clock. And then on Thursday morning, you'll tune in at 7:40 on Canvas and watch 45 minutes. And then you'll show up in the afternoon time for cohort D. Okay? So think of it like you have my class 4 times a week, okay, for 45 minutes each. Think of it that way. That's the easiest way to stay on track so that we don't fall behind. Any other questions I can cover? Well, Ricardo, you technically have 2 days at school because remember, if you're in cohort, what cohort are you in, Ricardo? So Ricardo, you're going to show up both on Monday and Tuesday because cohort A shows up in the morning time both Monday and Tuesday. Okay? So you're going to show up at school for 135 in the morning time on Monday, and then you'll be done with your sixth period by about 10:15, okay? And then on Tuesday you'll show back up again for periods 2, 4, 6. So if you're in cohort A, this is what your schedule will look like, okay? If you're in cohort B, this is what your schedule will look like. If you're in cohort C, this is what your schedule will look like. If you're in cohort D, this is what your schedule will look like. All right? All right. Friday is just office hours. That is correct. That is correct, Venkata. Okay. All right. Let's talk about the next phase of World War II, which is when Hitler turns the tables on. Yes, we start back Monday. That's right. Yes, we start back Monday. All right, this upcoming Monday, after the weekend. What does it mean when it says independent work? That's based on what your teachers tell you, Venkata. What I'm telling you for my class is tune into the remote YouTube lesson on all of your non-cohort days. Okay, for all the days that you're not in my class, you just tune in online like you've been doing. For your other teachers, you have to ask them what it means for independent work, because it's up to what your teachers tell you to do. All right? So, let's turn to Hitler turning the tables on Stalin. Remember that prior to the start of World War II, Hitler and Stalin had signed the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. And the reason that they signed that was so that Hitler wouldn't have to worry about a two-front war against both France and Britain from the west and the Soviet Union from the east. Unbeknownst to Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, Hitler had been making plans for an invasion of the Soviet Union. This becomes known as Operation Barbarossa. Barbarossa, okay? Operation Barbarossa, which means Redbeard, by the way. Okay, Barbarossa, Redbeard, Operation Redbeard. The plan was to do a three-prong attack, okay, against Leningrad, which is St. Petersburg in the north, Moscow in the middle, and Kiev in the south. So if you look at this map here, this is what I'm talking about. Three-prong attack. We have one offensive that's going up north. We have one offensive that's heading towards the center, towards Moscow. And then we have one offensive that's going to the south in Kiev. And then eventually they take Kiev and they continue pressing further east in the south towards a different city known as Stalingrad down here. So Leningrad, Moscow, Kiev, and then be pushed beyond Kiev into Stalingrad. And so the Nazis break the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. They stab Stalin in the back, and they invade the Soviet Union. All right? Now, there are some problems with the three-pronged strategy. Hitler severely underestimated how difficult it would be for the mechanized troops of the Nazis to penetrate into the interior of the Russian countryside. One of the major problems that they run into invading Russia is that Russia, as you guys should probably know, Russia was really far behind in terms of industrialization. And so unlike Britain, France, Germany, which have paved roads throughout most of their nations, Russia still lags behind. And because Russia lags behind, they don't have the paved roads that connect all the different regions of Russia together. Remember that Russia is really, really big. Because Russia is so huge, it makes it difficult to travel across it if there are no paved roads. So the Germans have to use their mechanized troops, which includes things like motorcycles, it includes armored cars and trucks, it includes tracked vehicles, half-track vehicles, it includes tanks, it includes mobile artillery. They have to transport all of that stuff into Russia to be able to launch their offensive. But because there are no paved roads, they're going to have to be doing it on dirt roads or just across, fields and plains and so on. And so they're going to be off-roading for a lot of it. And if you've ever been off-roading before, it slows you down. You can't be going 70 miles an hour while you're off-roading, okay, unless you want to flip your vehicle over and crash. So the other thing is that Russia, because they don't have paved roads, one of the advantages to paved roads as opposed to dirt roads, if you've ever traveled in your car down a dirt road and had a car in front of you, it kicks up dust like crazy. And it makes it very difficult to see what you're doing. That's even with just one car ahead of you. Imagine you have tons of tanks and motorcycles and other armored vehicles and half-track vehicles and other things like that that are traveling on these dirt roads. The dust envelops everything, all right? And then eventually the dry summer conditions that they're traveling through give way to rain and mud. And then the ground becomes saturated with moisture, and now you're trying to travel across these dirt roads that are completely muddy, and it slows the Nazi offensive down big time. Interestingly enough, odd fact, is that Napoleon with his horses actually made it across Russia to Moscow faster than Hitler did on horseback, because horses, being animals, are easier to get across mud, all right, and dust and stuff and dirt roads and stuff like that, because horses, it doesn't matter to them because they're animals. But vehicles, it's really difficult to get them across the dirt roads and off-roading conditions. Remember too that the blitzkrieg, which is the tactic of the lightning warfare that the Germans had been using, was really meant for smaller countries like Poland, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Czechoslovakia. All of those are relatively small nations where the blitzkrieg was pretty effective. Russia is literally, in terms of landmass, 40 times larger than France, okay? So the blitzkrieg tactic, where they have to rapidly swoop in and encircle the front lines, is not going to be as effective, number one, because they're not going to be as fast in Russia due to the roads. And then secondly, Russia's so huge that they have to move much farther distances into the interior than they would in France or other places where the blitzkrieg was more effective. Also, it goes without saying that the Russian weather in 1941, being extremely rainy in the fall time, in the autumn, and then brutally cold in the wintertime. Because what happens is all that rain falls in the autumn, the ground becomes saturated with moisture, which for a while means mud, but then eventually the temperatures dip so low that all of the moisture in the ground freezes. And the ground literally becomes as hard as concrete. Now, I grew up in Minnesota. Minnesota is in the Midwest. It's about as close to Canada as you can get and still be in the United States, which means that I grew up in extremely cold weather, just like they have in Russia. And I can tell you from my own experience growing up in that climate that if you were to try to take a shovel and go outside in the wintertime, first of all, you're going to have to dig first through about 3 feet of snow on the ground. But let's say that you finally get to the ground, the soil beneath the snow. If you try and take a shovel and dig into the ground in the middle of wintertime in Minnesota, you will break your shovel before you break the ground, because the ground becomes as hard as an ice block, okay? And so you're not going to be digging into the ground in Russia in the wintertime. The ground is completely frozen solid. And so the conditions, put it this way, the Germans really, really underestimated how brutal the winters would be on the German military. And so Russia, put in the most simplest terms, the invasion of Russia, Operation Barbarossa, does not go very well for Germany, particularly once winter hits, okay? It's going to be really bad. Here you can see German siege guns pounding Smolensk, which is another city on the road to taking over Moscow. And these kinds of cannons were you can see the size of them because it gives you some perspective here with these soldiers standing next to it. This is an 88 cannon, which means it's an 88 millimeter round that goes into it, which is a very large round. And these artillery siege guns would be placed, sometimes miles away from wherever they were attacking, because they could launch these massive rounds very, very far distances and still hit their target and do considerable damage. Here's the thing, the Germans also don't have anywhere close to the size of the military that the Russians did. And so, now I will say this, if we're comparing the German military and their technology, the tanks that the Germans had, the guns that the Germans had, the planes that the Germans had, all of them were far better designed than the Russian military equipment was. Okay, there's no question that if the Germans had had the size of the military that the Russians had, that probably would have helped them out considerably. But the German military, in terms of pure numbers of people serving in it, is much smaller than the Russian military. And so even though the Russian military was not as well equipped as the Germans, and the Russians themselves died in tremendous numbers at the hands of the Germans comparative to the number of the Germans that died in the invasion of Russia, which was far fewer. The problem was that for every 5 Russians you killed, there were another 10 to take their place. And so the Russians just kept on enlisting more people into their military to replace the extravagant numbers of losses that they had faced at the hands of the Germans. And there is no love lost between the Russians and the Germans during this conflict. The Russians and the Germans have a bitter, bitter hatred for one another during World War II. And you know, the Germans hate the Russians in part because they view them as racially inferior. The Russians hate the Germans because they view them as war aggressors, warmongers, and the Germans were killing just millions of Russian people, okay? Millions and millions of Russians lost their lives in World War II at the hands of the Germans. The Germans, to their credit, fought very effectively against the Russians with what they had. But over time, the Russians, give credit to the Russians where it's due, the Russian military, they fought tooth and nail and really did everything that they could to defend themselves against the German onslaught, and ultimately were able to wear the German military out to the point over the course of about a year and a half where the Germans were forced to retreat. So, one of the best known leaders of the German military was a guy named Heinz Guderian, General Heinz Guderian. Heinz Guderian was a tank commander. He was a general in the tank division of the German military. Guys like Heinz Guderian, even though they are fighting for the Nazi military, he's going to be one of these guys who was part of the Wehrmacht. Okay, Heinz Guderian was much older than Hitler was. He had served in World War I. Heinz Guderian was like an old school Prussian tank commander. Heinz Guderian isn't gonna, you know, when we talk about the Nazis, we kind of have to delineate between the Nazis like Heinz Guderian, who were military guys, okay, fighting in the war against the Russians or against the British or whatever, and then the guys from the SS like Himmler or that fat guy, I forget his name now, Goering, Hermann Goering, okay? Hermann Goering was the leader of the Luftwaffe, but he was also in charge of some SS stuff. So the SS, that's the Schutzstaffel. Those are the guys, remember, that are the party guys. They're the most diehard Nazis. They're the ones who are running the Holocaust and killing Jewish folks, okay? General Heinz Guderian is fighting a war. He's not involved with what's going on with the SS and in the concentration camps and the ghettos and all of that stuff that we've been learning about the last couple of days. All right, so he's just a tank commander. He's a general in the military. And that's why, for example, after the war, Heinz Guderian, when they hold a bunch of trials at the end of the war to punish these criminals who committed crimes against humanity and genocide, Heinz Guderian isn't punished because that wasn't, you know, first of all, Heinz Guderian famously got into an argument with Hitler and lost credibility and was taken off of his command post. So that's one reason, is because Heinz Guderian and Hitler had differences of opinion in how the war should be conducted. And so, you know, because Hitler is the leader of the whole military, since he's the leader of Germany at the time, Heinz Guderian is arguing essentially with his boss, and his boss says, well, I'm just going to relieve you of your duties and reassign you somewhere else. But Guderian doesn't get in trouble for any of the war crimes because he was, you know, he was fighting a war and wasn't involved in what was going on in the concentration camps and stuff like that. In September of 1941, Hitler ordered General Guderian, who was leading the Moscow assault, to encircle Kiev in the south. And Guderian was ambivalent about this plan because he was very close to taking Moscow at this time. They were just outside the gates of Moscow, and Hitler orders Guderian to circle south and capture a bunch of Russians, and then return back to Moscow afterwards. This was one of the largest encirclement movements. Yes, that's right, Venkata. That is right. Okay. And so encircle 650,000 Russian troops who get taken as prisoners of war. POW means prisoner of war. And so Guderian encircles south. It's the largest encirclement in military history. Over 500,000 Russians are forced to surrender. This is one of the examples in the early part of the assault of Germany where things are going well for the Germans in the very, very beginning. After Kiev is taken so by the way, in case you're wondering, where are we talking about here? Here's Guderian. Guderian was all the way up here outside the gates of Moscow, ready to lead an assault on Moscow. But what Hitler orders Guderian to do is, because he's up here, he orders him to swing south and cut off reinforcements coming from the east to Kiev. And so right in this region here, because Guderian swings down and encircles all the Russians that were in this area, they get cut off. They are completely surrounded by Germans by that point, and they are forced to surrender, and they are taken prisoner by the Nazi military. All right, so that gives you kind of an idea of what I'm talking about. And the Nazis continue past Kiev. So here's what I was talking about. When they take Kiev after that giant encirclement, they decide to continue progressing further towards the east, towards Stalingrad. This can be seen as a major operational mistake by Hitler, because as they progress onwards to the east to try to take Stalingrad, they are going to find themselves in the worst conditions that you could possibly think about fighting in terms of the Russian winter. All right. So turning points in the war in terms of fighting the Nazi-Soviet conflict. First of all, they never capture St. Petersburg. Leningrad is never captured, and the Nazis are repelled by the Soviet Siberian forces at Moscow. And you are going to see one of the coolest parts of the documentary is when you see the Soviet Siberian forces who are immune to the cold. Imagine you're playing a video game, right? And you know how different, like, let's say you're playing, like, whatever, a World War II real-time strategy game. If you were using the Soviet Siberian troops, they would have like +20 cold resistance. You know, the Germans would have like -20 cold resistance in terms of their stats. Germans would have like +20 to artillery and tanks. You know, Russians, you'd have like a special unit with reindeer and skis. All right, and you can see in the documentary a scene where the Russians are using skis and reindeer as well as machine guns as they are repelling the Germans' assault against Moscow. And so these Siberian forces, being immune to the cold and being well equipped, are able to defend Moscow effectively. And once again, Moscow is not taken completely, and the Germans are just doing everything they can to completely destroy these cities from a distance. Stalingrad, though, is the first time that there's a Nazi defeat. So they are there in December of 41, all the way over to December of 1942. Yeah, today the documentary is going to be heavily focused on the invasion of Russia. That's right. Yep. That's what today's episode is going to be about. Now, Stalingrad, here was the problem with Stalingrad. And just to remind you where Stalingrad is, it's down here. It's this one, okay? This one over here. Stalingrad, just because it's further south, don't let that confuse you. It's still quite far north, and it still gets brutally, brutally cold in Stalingrad. And as they lead their assault to Stalingrad, remember, it takes them time. They took Kiev in right around September, October of 1941. It's going to take them a while to continue proceeding past that further into the interior, twice the distance of what they have already traveled to Stalingrad. And when they get to Stalingrad, they basically bomb Stalingrad into the ground. Stalingrad is nothing but a giant heap of rubble because the Germans are using their dive bombing planes, they're using artillery like these 88 cannons to just pound the city of Stalingrad. They pound it so much, the Luftwaffe in particular, the German Air Force, obliterates Stalingrad through daily bombings. But the Wehrmacht, the ground troops, okay, the ground infantry troops, can't secure Stalingrad because there's nothing there to secure. They almost bomb Stalingrad so effectively that it makes Stalingrad just an absolute nightmare to try to hold on to, because there's nothing to hold on to there. It's just a giant heap of destroyed buildings. And every time they take a new sector of Stalingrad, the Russians run around and grab a different sector where the German troops aren't at. So they keep on having this stalemate where they're running around trying to take over Stalingrad, but they just can't seem to secure it. Meanwhile, by December, the weather has turned to complete tundra-like conditions. And eventually, the Nazis just say, there's nothing here to take. We can't take Stalingrad. It's just a nightmare. Okay, there's nothing left here to secure. And the Russians just keep coming and undermining all of our operations. And so after Stalingrad in December of 1942 is really what we consider to be a major turning point in the East, because it's the first time that the Germans are forced to retreat, okay? It's the first time that they are actually defeated on land and that the blitzkrieg does not work. So after the Battle of Stalingrad, which is ultimately tallied up as a loss for the Germans, the Soviet military, the Russians, began the 2.5-year-long campaign of pushing the German army back all the way to Berlin, the capital of Germany. So it takes the Russians 2.5 years. The Germans aren't just going to retreat all the way back to Berlin right away. When they turn away from Stalingrad, the Russians start their offensive to push the Germans back. And over the course of the next 2.5 years, they're going to push the Germans all the way back through Russia, through Eastern Europe, Poland, and mostly Poland, and then back into Germany. And by the time that March and April of 1945 rolls around, the German military is on its last legs, and they are barely able to defend the city of Berlin, the capital city of Germany. And and by that point, of course, by 1945, not only are the Russians pushing back from the east, the Americans and British are coming up through Italy and down through France. So by the time that 1944-45 rolls around, the Germans are now fighting a three-front war from the west, from the south, and from the east. And it's just going to be way, way too much for them to be able to handle. All right. So here you can see kind of what I was talking about. This is a photograph of what Stalingrad looked like. As you can see, not much there. Giant heaps of rubble, war-torn buildings, bombs exploding. It's a giant war zone, literally. Meanwhile, in North Africa, okay, the Germans had troops stationed in North Africa. And the leader of the troops down in North Africa were led by this guy named Erwin Rommel. Erwin Rommel is sometimes nicknamed the Desert Fox. The Desert Fox. He was pretty much considered to be the youngest and brightest general in the Wehrmacht, and technically he was a field marshal, but we'll call him a general. Okay, and he defeats the British in North Africa, and the British are being pushed back to Egypt. The capital of Egypt is Cairo. So if we can see here, we can't, not on that map. Let me see, do I have a different one? No. Okay, let me find a map of World War II Africa. So the North African campaign was waged in the desert, which is really interesting because as the Soviet campaign is being fought by the Germans, they're in freezing conditions. Okay, they may as well be fighting in the North Pole. It's so cold. And then some other German divisions are fighting in the heat of the desert in North Africa, the Saharan desert. All right? And you know, I'm sure you've seen images of the Saharan desert. It's desolate, okay? And it's ridiculously hot. It was so hot that you could fry eggs on the top of the German tanks. Okay, they were as hot as frying pans. And so it was ridiculously hot in North Africa, which goes to show you the different extremes that different sections of the German military could be fighting in. And in North Africa, the leader is this guy, Erwin Rommel. He's pictured right here. And he is the Desert Fox. He was extremely effective in fighting against the British. And again, Erwin Rommel, interesting story about Rommel. Once again, Erwin Rommel falls out of favor with Hitler. But Erwin Rommel was a beloved figure of the German population while the war is happening. There are tons of propaganda articles published about Erwin Rommel and how amazing he is and how effectively he's fighting against the British and how he's a hero of the state. The Nazi Party had glorified Erwin Rommel, and he had become quite a famous military commander in the war, kind of similar to how Eisenhower was really famous in the United States, as well as MacArthur. Okay, Douglas MacArthur was another famous leader, or Patton. You know, some of these military leaders who make big names for themselves become kind of national heroes, and Erwin Rommel was one of the German national heroes during the war. However, interesting story about Rommel is that towards the end of the war, Rommel loses faith in Hitler's leadership and ends up learning of a plot to remove Hitler from power, and very quietly lends his approval to this plot. And so, but here's the thing, this is all secret, right? This is all secret stuff. The plot to remove Hitler was from a number of other high-ranking German officials who believed that Hitler was the one that was losing them the war. These guys are military figures. The number one thing that is in their mind is that they want to win this war. And when they start losing faith in Hitler's leadership and plan this plot against him, Unfortunately, the plot gets discovered by Hitler and other top Nazis. Erwin Rommel is brought in, he's arrested, he is brought in, and basically he is forced to commit suicide. So he is forced to shoot himself. And so Erwin Rommel, here's the thing that was interesting about it, is that because he was such a huge figure and everybody knew Rommel's name and trusted Rommel and all of these kinds of things, the Nazis, by this point, this is late in the war that this happens, right around 1944, by this point in the war, the Nazis don't want any bad press about Rommel to shake people's confidence in Hitler. And so instead of telling people that Erwin Rommel was a traitor and that he was engaged in a plot to overthrow Hitler, the Nazis hide that information from the news, and they say that he died from an unfortunate accident or something like that, and they give him a state burial with all of the Nazi flags and all of that other stuff, because they don't want people to lose confidence in Hitler's leadership the way that Rommel had. If they published a story in the press to the rest of the public, for people to read, and people started reading news stories about how Rommel lost faith in Hitler's leadership, that might cause them to lose faith because he was such a huge figure. So instead, they hide all of that information while the war is going on. They give him a state funeral, even though Hitler hated Rommel by the end, because Rommel, was going to take Hitler out of power if he could. And Rommel too disagreed with Hitler in how he was waging the war. So once again, another guy who, this is why the story of World War II is complex, because it's very easy to look at these guys, well, a Nazi's a Nazi and they were all evil and so on and so forth. Well, yeah, maybe, but also, maybe different degrees of evil. I'm not saying Erwin Rommel was a good guy. He was still a hardcore racist. He was still a hardcore anti-Semite, okay? But he wasn't engaged in the murdering of Jewish folks. He's a military commander. He's not even in Europe at this time. He's in Africa for most of it. And so, once again, a story where it's like, well, some of these people had enough brains to question Hitler. And there's a very famous movie that came out a while ago, and I got to be honest with you, I'm not exactly a huge Tom Cruise fan, but I must admit that he's quite good in this movie. It's called Valkyrie, okay? And the movie Valkyrie, spelt like that, it's a great movie. It's really, really good, and it is about the most famous attempt to remove Hitler from power by assassinating him. So there's a group of, Klaus von Stauffenberg was this guy's name. Klaus von Stauffenberg was a German officer who had lost an arm and an eye in the war. And Stauffenberg and a number of other high-ranking Nazi officials attempted to assassinate Hitler at the Wolf's Lair, which was Hitler's secret bunker in Germany. And it fails. And Hitler, all of the plot unravels, and each of the co-conspirators in this plot to assassinate Hitler are shot right before the end of the war. And it's a sad movie. It's a really sad movie because, as I say, there were people who learned about the Holocaust, who disagreed with the Holocaust. And I'm not apologizing for the Nazis because the Nazis needed to be defeated, but at least it adds complexity to the story rather than just telling an overly simplified story of all Nazis are evil, all Americans and British and Russians are good in World War II. You know, there are atrocities committed on both sides of the war, and there are humans. These people are human beings that are involved in the war on all sides, and some of these human beings are complex people, complex individuals with complex views, and they, in some sense, some of them attempted to stand up against Hitler, and in some cases even attempt to assassinate Hitler. And even though those attempts ended up being ultimately unsuccessful and these men ended up being shot, it's an important story in history to tell. So that's why I mention it. So anyhow, Rommel, the Desert Fox, youngest and brightest general in the Wehrmacht, he defeats the British in North Africa. The British are pushed back, and the Italians, meanwhile, which are allied with the Germans in this war, remember, the Italians began invading Greece and Yugoslavia in Eastern Europe. So these regions down here, the Italians are going to attack Yugoslavia and Greece down this way, all right? The Italians, not as big of a contributor to the war as the Germans, obviously, but Bulgaria and Hungary joined the Axis powers as well in 1941, and so you know, the Axis powers are growing. Many of the reasons that the Bulgarians and the Hungarians joined the Nazi powers instead of the Allied powers is because Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria in these regions down here were facing threats from Russia for centuries beforehand. And so they didn't want to see the Soviets win the war and have their countries taken over, which, by the way, is exactly what ends up happening. And so that's why Hungary and Bulgaria joined with Germany, is because Russia to them was a bigger threat than Germany was. And so to them, they're looking at their odds and they're saying, well, we'd rather have the Germans win the war, because if they don't win the war, the Russians are going to take us over. And that is exactly what ends up happening. All right. And then let's see here. Okay, so then there's a new turning point in the war in North Africa. Okay, Erwin Rommel had been fighting largely. Let me find a map here. That's what I was going to do. I forgot to do that. Let me pull up a map of this. Okay, now we're working with, now we're cooking with gas here. Let's see what we're looking at here. Let me find a good one. Possibly this one. Maybe this one. Let's do this one here. All right. So this gives you a map of North Africa. As you can see, they're fighting in the Saharan desert. It is ridiculously hot. All of these areas, if you've ever seen Star Wars before, all of the desert scenes on Tatooine, okay, the desert planet where Luke Skywalker is, okay, also where Anakin Skywalker is from, all of those were filmed in Tunisia. That should give you an idea of the setting that we're talking about here. Just imagine the desert landscape of Tatooine, because that's literally where it was filmed, was in Tunisia. And that's basically what all of this terrain is like. It's basically sand, dirt, and desert, all right? It is really, really miserable conditions to be fighting in. The British had held Egypt as a colony for a long time. And so the British were fighting out of Cairo, and the Germans were fighting out of Tunisia. And they were fighting across this entire strip of northern Libya, out of Tripoli and Benghazi, okay? And the Germans, when they first are fighting, are really effective against the British fighting over here. And they push the British all the way back to Cairo, and the Germans have largely secured most of these North African regions until the turning point happens. And the turning point happens when the Americans enter the war in Europe. Now, we haven't talked too much about America, but we are going to be talking more about America as we progress throughout the rest of this unit here. But just to give you a little, to catch you up to speed, how do the Americans enter into the whole conflict? Well, in December of 1941, December 7th, 1941 actually, to be specific, the Japanese attacked the American naval port at in Hawaii known as Pearl Harbor. Okay, Pearl Harbor. And Pearl Harbor was in Hawaii. Now, Hawaii at that time in World War II was not a state yet. America only had 48 states during World War II. The last two states to enter into the United States were Hawaii and Alaska. But they don't become states until about 1956 or somewhere in that area, okay, after the war ends, about a decade after the war ends. And so when the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, they are attacking a naval base, an American naval base, but they technically have not attacked American territory because Hawaii was kind of not really a state yet. Okay, and so when Pearl Harbor is bombed, America joins the war, but America's focus in the early part of joining the war is going to be in the Pacific, fighting against the Japanese. The Americans are not going to come over to Europe right away. They plan things out. And the operation that is devised between the Americans and the British, who are allies with one another in the war, is known as Operation Torch. Operation Torch was going to take place in North Africa. And going back to this map here, all right, this is where the Americans enter in from the west, okay, in these areas that were French colonies. And the Americans start pushing from the west towards Tunisia, while the British push from the east over here from Egypt. And so the Germans, being in the middle around Tunisia, start to be pinched on either side and fighting on both sides of these areas here in North Africa. And this is what ultimately causes Rommel, the leader of the German Africa Corps, to have to give up his position, and he retreats. I don't know if we can see it on this map, barely. Okay, he ends up retreating up through Tunis, which is the capital of Tunisia, to Sicily and up into Italy. And of course, the Americans and the British, who are closing in, follow them up and move up into Italy and start attacking Germany from the south, okay, through Italy. And so that's Operation Torch, the pincer movement, where the Americans attacked from the west, the British attacked from the east in an allied operation to push the Germans out of North Africa. And when they do so, they are then able to enter into what was nicknamed the underbelly of Europe, up through Italy. The Italians didn't know what to do because the Italians don't have very effective fighting forces compared to the British and the Americans. And so sometimes the Italians would shoot at you, other times the Italians would join up with the Americans. You never knew what the Italians were going to do. They would switch sides all the time during the war, and this was a liability, and it was upsetting, of course, to the Germans as well. But anyhow, that's where we get into the invasion of Sicily and Italy, is after Operation Torch vanquishes Erwin Rommel and the Africa Corps from the Nazi military out of North Africa. Just to give you a little bit of background on what America had been doing prior to the start of the war, or to their entrance into the war, America had really tried to stay out of another European conflict because they remembered what happened in World War I. America doesn't want to get bogged down in another global conflict over Europe. Okay? America has their own fish to fry on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. They don't really care about what's going on in Europe at first, and that's why FDR, in order to maintain peace, signed what was known as the Neutrality Acts. America was going to remain neutral in this conflict in the 1930s. And this prevented FDR from drawing the U.S. into the conflict earlier, despite the fact that FDR and Winston Churchill had a really good working relationship with one another. Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Britain, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States, had a really good relationship with one another, and Britain wants FDR to declare war on Germany so that they can get some help. But FDR, because of the Neutrality Acts, can't just declare war because war has to be declared by Congress. And these laws in America had been passed that guaranteed that America would stay out of World War II. So instead of lending military assistance directly with the American troops, there's a law that's passed in 1941 before Pearl Harbor is attacked, called the Lend-Lease Act. And what the Lend-Lease Act did was it gave large amounts of money and supplies to help Britain and the Soviet Union help fight against the Nazis. This effectively ended U.S. neutrality because now we are lending assistance to the Allied powers, and we have effectively taken a stance in the war with Britain and the Soviet Union, who by this point is being attacked by the Nazis. And so the Lend-Lease Act tips our hand toward the Allied powers, but we're still not militarily engaged in war. We have not sent troops over or anything like that. It's all basically financial assistance and equipment assistance. We gave them planes, we gave them tanks, we gave them bullets, we gave them guns, we gave them money, but we didn't give them troops until we get involved in the war. And it's when America signs the Lend-Lease Act that Japan starts to plot this attack against the United States at Pearl Harbor. The Atlantic Charter of August of 1941, remember the United States by this point in August of December, remember we don't get involved until December of 1941. In August of 1941, the United States had not yet formally involved themselves in the war, but Churchill and FDR met secretly, okay, after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. And Churchill and FDR have this secret meeting with each other to decide how America would become involved in this conflict. And they basically decide that once the Axis powers were defeated, that there would be no territorial changes contrary to the wishes of the inhabitants of the people across Europe. Okay? So they aren't going to completely redraw the borders the way that they did at the end of World War I, when the Treaty of Versailles was being negotiated, which upset a bunch of people because they were drawing lines against the wishes of the inhabitants of various places. This idea is known as self-determination. In other words, the people of a particular place should determine the government of that place. So this was known as the Atlantic Charter of 1941, and Churchill and FDR are already, even before America becomes officially involved in the war, Churchill and FDR are already making secret plans about how to go about fighting against the Nazis, defeating the Nazis, and then what will happen after the war when America and Britain win. The other thing that the Atlantic Charter called for was a permanent system of general security. And this was playing on the same idea that previous former president Woodrow Wilson had about the League of Nations. Now, you might remember the League of Nations failed, right? The League of Nations was unsuccessful in maintaining peace because here we are in World War II. But they want to kind of go back to the drawing board, come up with a new general security plan, And this one would be known as the United Nations. And by the way, the United Nations is still around today. And so this was another plan that they had for the post-war once Germany was defeated. Stalin also ultimately gets pulled into these conversations and endorsed this idea soon thereafter. But we're going to learn about how Stalin changes his mind later on in the war. But we're not to that point yet. But that brings me to where I needed to get to for today. We are moving on to episode 4 of the documentary. I will post that within the next few minutes here. So please get that done by I'll make that one due for Monday so that you're not overloaded with homework. But make sure that you watch episode 4 of the Apocalypse World War II documentary series that we've been making our way through. And then that will be due for Monday. And then when we return to school on Monday, yes, that's right, Arnav. So only cohort A and B are going to be showing up to school on Monday and Tuesday. Cohort A shows up in the morning time on Monday and Tuesday. Cohort B shows up in the afternoon time on Monday and Tuesday. But if you're in cohort C and D, you don't want to miss out on the classes that I'm teaching to those other kids. So you better be tuning in on Monday morning and Monday afternoon, or Tuesday morning and Tuesday afternoon, okay? To what goes on in those classes so that you don't fall behind in the start of the week. All right, so if you're in cohort C and D, okay, make sure that you're watching the live stream on Tuesday morning and Tuesday afternoon so that you don't miss what happens. Okay? All right, folks. So, any other questions? Okay, well, if there are no other questions, we will, well, it's not really your last Zoom because first of all, we're not on Zoom, but secondly, remember that all of the things for the days that you are not in my physical classroom, every time that I have second period, I'm going to be live streaming on YouTube. So don't miss out on that. Okay. All right. That's it for me, folks. Have a wonderful rest of your day.